The other passengers on the Houston to Chicago flight thought Robert Kim was pathetic. He jumped at every noise, gripped his seat during normal turbulence, and looked like he might have a panic attack during takeoff. They assumed he was just another anxious traveler who should have taken a bus instead. But when violent criminals took control of their plane at 30,000 feet, they learned that Robert's terror wasn't about flying itself. It was about the last time he'd been in an aircraft, when his helicopter was hit by enemy fire, and he was the only survivor. Welcome to Silent Heroes. Before we begin this incredible story of courage, survival, and what happens when crisis reveals true character, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe that sometimes our greatest fears hide our greatest strengths, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Robert Kim had been dreading this flight for 3 weeks, ever since his company had assigned him to the Chicago conference that would require him to board a commercial aircraft for the first time in 18 months. As a senior software engineer for a Houston-based tech firm, Robert could usually handle business trips by car or arrange video conferences to avoid the one thing that still triggered panic attacks that left him shaking and nauseous. At 41, Robert looked like any other business traveler walking through George Bush Intercontinental Airport that Tuesday morning. Medium build, black hair starting to gray at the temples, wire-rimmed glasses, and a navy blue suit that fit well enough to suggest professional success. His rolling carry-on bag and laptop case marked him as someone who traveled for work, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed the way his eyes constantly scanned exits and the slight tremor in his hands as he approached the departure gate. The boarding process for American Airlines Flight 18047 to Chicago O'Hare had been routine for everyone except Robert, who'd spent 20 minutes in the airport restroom splashing cold water on his face and practicing the breathing exercises his therapist had taught him. He'd taken his prescribed anxiety medication, reviewed the aircraft safety statistics that logically proved flying was safer than driving, and reminded himself that this was just a 2-hour flight that would be over before he knew it. None of those rational preparations had helped when he'd actually stepped onto the Boeing 737 and felt the familiar wave of claustrophobia and panic that came with being enclosed in an aluminum tube that would soon be 6 miles above the ground. Robert had located his assigned seat, 14C, stowed his bag with hands that visibly shook, and immediately began the mental battle between his logical mind, which knew commercial aviation was statistically safe, and his traumatized nervous system, which remembered the sound of enemy fire tearing through aircraft metal. The passengers around Robert had noticed his obvious distress almost immediately. The businessman in 14A, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit who'd been talking loudly on his phone about quarterly earnings, had glanced over with undisguised annoyance when Robert had asked the flight attendant 3 separate questions about expected turbulence during the flight. Some people just shouldn't fly. The businessman had muttered to his colleague across the aisle, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear, "If you're that scared of being in an airplane, take a Greyhound bus next time." The woman in 14B, a well-dressed professional who'd been scrolling through emails on her tablet, had looked up with obvious irritation when Robert had fumbled with his seatbelt for nearly a minute, his hands too shaky to manage the simple mechanism that everyone else had secured effortlessly. "Sir, do you need help with that?" she'd asked in the tone of someone speaking to a child, drawing more attention from surrounding passengers who were now watching Robert's struggle with mixture of amusement and impatience. During the safety demonstration, Robert had gripped his armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and when the flight attendant had demonstrated the oxygen mask procedures, his breathing had become so rapid and shallow that the passenger behind him had leaned forward with genuine concern. "Hey buddy, you okay up there?" the man had asked. "You look like you're about to pass out." Robert had managed to nod and mumble something about being fine, but his obvious distress had become a source of entertainment for nearby passengers who'd begun making quiet jokes about the grown man having a meltdown over a routine flight. As Flight 18047 had taxied toward the runway, Robert's anxiety had escalated to levels that bordered on panic attack. The sound of the engine spooling up for takeoff had triggered vivid flashbacks to another aircraft, in another time, when engine noise had been followed by the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire and the metallic screech of rotor blades being shredded by enemy bullets. What the other passengers couldn't see, and what Robert had never told his co-workers or even his therapist in complete detail, was that his fear of flying wasn't irrational anxiety about commercial aviation safety. It was post-traumatic stress disorder, stemming from his service as an Army helicopter pilot in Afghanistan, where he'd completed 3 combat tours flying Chinook helicopters in some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. Chief Warrant Officer Robert Kim had been one of the most experienced and decorated pilots in his unit. With over 2,500 flight hours in combat zones and a reputation for successfully completing missions that other pilots considered too dangerous to attempt, he'd flown medical evacuation missions under enemy fire, transported special forces teams into hostile territory, and provided close air support for ground troops engaged in intense firefights with Taliban and al-Qaeda forces. His military career had ended abruptly on March 15, 2019. During what should have been a routine personnel transport mission from Forward Operating Base Chapman to a smaller outpost in eastern Afghanistan. Robert had been piloting a Chinook helicopter carrying 12 soldiers when his aircraft had been hit by coordinated small arms fire from a well-planned ambush in a valley that intelligence reports had indicated was secure. The first rounds had struck the helicopter's rear rotor assembly, causing immediate loss of tail rotor authority and sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin. Robert had managed to maintain partial control long enough to execute a hard landing that prevented the helicopter from exploding on impact. But the crash had killed 11 of the 12 soldiers on board and left Robert as the sole survivor with injuries that had ended his flying career permanently. The physical wounds had healed within 6 months, but the psychological trauma of being the only person to walk away from a crash that had killed 11 men under his command had created a form of survivor's guilt that made any form of aviation unbearable. Every time Robert heard aircraft engines, his nervous system interpreted the sound as a prelude to incoming enemy fire, mechanical failure, and the deaths of people he was responsible for protecting. As Flight 18047 had climbed to cruising altitude, Robert had employed every coping mechanism he'd learned during 18 months of therapy and counseling. He'd focused on his breathing, reminded himself that he was in a commercial aircraft flown by experienced civilian pilots, and tried to distinguish between past trauma and present reality. The other passengers had continued to watch his struggle with a mixture of amusement and irritation. The businessmen in 14A had made increasingly loud comments about people who shouldn't fly if they couldn't handle basic air travel, while other nearby passengers had begun taking pictures and videos of Robert's obvious distress, apparently finding his fear entertaining enough to share on social media. "Look at this guy," one passenger had whispered to his friend while pointing his phone camera toward Robert. "He's acting like the plane's about to crash. Probably never been on an airplane before." Robert had endured the mockery and attention with the same stoic determination that had carried him through 3 combat deployments, focusing on the fact that the flight was only 2 hours long and that he'd be back on solid ground before noon. He'd closed his eyes, controlled his breathing, and tried to ignore the ongoing commentary from passengers who seemed to find his anxiety both puzzling and amusing. What none of them could have anticipated was that Flight 11847 was about to face a genuine emergency that would test everyone's courage and reveal exactly why Robert Kim had been reacting to aircraft engines with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned to associate flying with life-and-death situations. At 10:47 a.m. Central Time, approximately 45 minutes into the flight, 3 men who'd been sitting separately throughout the cabin suddenly stood up simultaneously and began moving toward the cockpit with coordinated precision that immediately indicated this wasn't a coincidence or passenger emergency. The first man, who'd been sitting in 3A near the front of the plane, produced what appeared to be an improvised weapon from his carry-on bag and began shouting demands for passengers to remain seated. The second man, positioned in the middle of the cabin, revealed a similar weapon and began moving toward the rear of the aircraft to control passengers in the back sections. The third man headed directly for the cockpit door, carrying what looked like tools designed to breach the reinforced barrier that separated the flight deck from the passenger cabin. For most of the passengers on Flight 147, this was their first experience with an actual hijacking attempt, and their reactions ranged from stunned disbelief to immediate panic. People began screaming, fumbling for their phones to call 911, and looking around desperately for flight attendants or air marshals who might be able to intervene. But for Robert Kim, the situation triggered a completely different response. The same nervous system that had been interpreting normal flight operations as potential threats suddenly recognized an actual tactical emergency that required immediate action. His hypervigilance, which had seemed like pathetic anxiety to other passengers, instantly became the enhanced situational awareness that had once made him one of the most effective combat pilots in his unit. Robert's hands stopped shaking. His breathing steadied. The panic that had gripped him since boarding the aircraft was replaced by the calm, analytical mindset that had enabled him to successfully complete dozens of high-risk missions in combat zones, where hesitation meant death for everyone under his command. While other passengers were still processing what was happening, Robert was already conducting a tactical assessment of the hijackers' positions, weapons, and apparent objectives. His military training automatically cataloged escape routes, potential weapons, and the most efficient methods for neutralizing the threats while minimizing risk to civilian passengers. The lead hijacker, now controlling the front section of the cabin, made the mistake that Robert had been waiting for. In his focus on intimidating passengers and maintaining control of the situation, the man had positioned himself with his back partially turned toward Robert's seat, presenting an opportunity for intervention that any experienced combat veteran would recognize as tactically viable. Robert moved with the swift, silent precision of someone who'd been trained to operate in life-and-death situations. He unbuckled his seatbelt, rose from his seat, and covered the distance to the hijacker in 3 quick steps that brought him within striking range before the man realized he was being approached. The other passengers, who'd spent the entire flight mocking Robert's apparent cowardice, watched in stunned amazement as the man they'd dismissed as pathetic suddenly demonstrated combat skills that most people only see in movies. Robert's attack was swift, efficient, and devastatingly effective, neutralizing the first hijacker before the man could react or warn his accomplices. "Everyone stay down and stay quiet," Robert commanded in the authoritative voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed during emergency situations. "This is not over yet." The transformation was so complete and sudden that many passengers initially didn't recognize Robert as the same man who'd been gripping his armrests in terror just minutes earlier. The confident, competent person now taking charge of the situation seemed like an entirely different individual from the anxious traveler they'd been ridiculing since takeoff. Robert quickly secured the first hijacker's weapon and began moving systematically through the cabin to locate and neutralize the remaining threats. His movements were purposeful and precise, demonstrating tactical knowledge and combat experience that was impossible to fake or improvise. The second hijacker, positioned in the middle of the cabin, turned toward the commotion and found himself facing someone who clearly possessed military training and combat experience. The man's improvised weapon and intimidation tactics, which had been effective against frightened civilians, were useless against someone who'd faced much more dangerous enemies in much more threatening situations. Robert's engagement with the second hijacker was brief and decisive, ending with another threat neutralized and another weapon secured. The passengers, who were now watching Robert with something approaching awe rather than mockery, began to understand that they were witnessing someone with professional-level combat skills handle a crisis that could have ended in tragedy. The third hijacker, who'd been attempting to breach the cockpit door, realized that his operation was failing, and his accomplices had been subdued by someone who clearly wasn't an ordinary passenger. But instead of surrendering, the man became increasingly desperate and dangerous, threatening to harm passengers if Robert didn't allow him to complete his mission. This was the moment that tested every aspect of Robert's military training and combat experience. In Afghanistan, he'd been responsible for protecting soldiers under his command during helicopter operations that often involved split-second decisions about when to engage enemy forces and when to prioritize evacuation and safety. Now he faced a similar decision aboard a commercial aircraft filled with innocent civilians who were depending on him to resolve the situation without anyone getting hurt. Robert's approach to the final hijacker demonstrated the strategic thinking and tactical patience that had made him effective in combat operations. Rather than rushing into a confrontation that might endanger passengers, he positioned himself to minimize risk while maintaining the initiative, using his knowledge of human psychology and crisis management to de-escalate the situation while remaining ready to take decisive action if necessary. The resolution came when Robert successfully convinced the final hijacker that his mission had failed and that surrender was his only viable option. The man's capitulation marked the end of an attempted hijacking that could have resulted in tragedy if not for the intervention of someone with exactly the right combination of combat experience, tactical knowledge, and psychological strength to handle the crisis effectively. As Flight 18047 was diverted to the nearest airport for an emergency landing, Robert found himself surrounded by passengers who were struggling to reconcile the confident, competent person who'd just saved their lives with the anxious, fearful man they'd been mocking since takeoff. "Sir," said the businessman from 14A, his voice carrying none of the condescending tone he'd used earlier, "I don't understand what just happened. How did you know what to do? Are you law enforcement or military?" Robert looked around at the faces of people who'd spent 2 hours assuming he was weak, cowardly, and pathetic, and saw something he hadn't expected: genuine curiosity rather than judgment, respect rather than mockery. "I was an Army helicopter pilot," Robert said simply. "3 tours in Afghanistan. I retired after my aircraft was shot down, and 11 soldiers under my command were killed. That's why I was afraid of flying today. Not because I don't understand aviation, but because I understand it too well. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of recognition, as passengers began to understand the true source of Robert's earlier distress. The man they'd dismissed as cowardly had been reliving memories of genuine combat trauma, and his apparent weakness had actually been evidence of psychological wounds earned in service of his country. "You saved our lives," said the woman from 14B, her voice carrying genuine gratitude and more than a little shame about her earlier attitude. "If you hadn't been on this flight, those men might have succeeded. We owe you everything." Robert shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. I did what anyone with my training would have done in the same situation." But the passengers understood that Robert's response to the hijacking hadn't been luck or coincidence. It had been the result of years of military training, combat experience, and the kind of psychological strength that enabled someone to function effectively under pressure, even while dealing with personal trauma that would have disabled most people. As emergency responders boarded the aircraft after landing, Robert was approached by FBI agents who needed to understand exactly what had happened during the attempted hijacking. His detailed, professional account of the incident, delivered with the precision and clarity of someone accustomed to post-mission debriefings, confirmed what the passengers had witnessed. They'd been saved by someone whose apparent weakness had concealed extraordinary strength and capability. The story of Flight 18047 and Robert Kim's heroic intervention spread quickly through news media and social networks, but Robert himself declined most interview requests and publicity opportunities. He'd returned to his quiet life as a software engineer in Houston, continuing his therapy for PTSD while also serving as a volunteer counselor for other veterans struggling with similar challenges. The passengers who'd mocked Robert's anxiety during the flight became some of his strongest advocates, sharing their story as a reminder that assumptions about weakness and strength are often completely wrong, and that the people we dismiss as broken or cowardly might actually be heroes carrying invisible wounds from their service to others. Robert Kim never fully overcame his anxiety about flying, and he continued to avoid air travel whenever possible. But he'd proven to himself and others that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the ability to act effectively despite fear, especially when other people's safety depends on your actions. The passengers of Flight 18047 learned that day that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare, that strength sometimes looks like vulnerability, and that the people we're quickest to judge might be exactly the people we need most when crisis reveals what really matters.